Morning, and thanks for being here. Those of you in person, always good to have a live audience. Those of you who've joined online, thank you as well. You're in for a real treat today, and that is not because you're really too interested in hearing more bad news about the state of the country. There's plenty, although we are going to diagnose it for you. And the first part of the treat is that the diagnosis will be thorough, it will be extensive, it'll be detailed, but it also will be pointed to solutions to the problem in a very typical Heritage fashion. So as we like to say, we will read reality truthfully, but then also posit some solutions. But the second is, in addition to my terrific colleagues who are the best in the business, we're also joined by not just a member of Congress and not just a member of Congress from the greatest state, known as Texas, but also someone who, and you have to account for my bias as a friend, I think is one of the statesmen of our age. And if you think about the topic that we're covering today, defunding the left, the strategy to save America, our focus will be on how taxpayers' money is used against the interests of taxpayers. You know, we're all shaken each morning and evening or during the day when we're watching these ridiculous protests by anti-Semites at college campuses. That problem that's even happening in the 2020s is difficult enough for us to digest. But when we also consider that that problem has been financed for decades by the taxpayers' money through the U.S. Department of Education, through many other agencies, as we'll talk about today, then it really ought to be a gut punch. But the good news is that Americans are tired of the federal government and its ridiculous alphabet soup of agencies using their money against their sovereignty, against their freedom, against their prosperity. And so by the end of this discussion today that I'll have with the congressman, that my colleagues will have, going into a little more detail, I'm hopeful that you will leave here motivated not only to fix the problem, but also be armed with some solutions that you can be part of. As I mentioned, you're in for a treat because of Congressman Chip Roy. He has been a member of Congress for several years, immediately prior to serving in Congress. So immediately prior that it was the day before he announced running for Congress, he and I were colleagues at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And I can tell you that just as it is here at Heritage, it was there. We never want great people to leave, but we do want great men and women to be willing to throw their hat in the arena and be as terrific a member of Congress, not just for his district, not just for Texas, but for all of us who believe that in spite of America's dark days today, that decline is not irreversible, and that in fact, we're going to take America back. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Congressman Chip Roy of Texas. No problem. Good, thanks.
Well, thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here, and as Kevin said, we're friends going way back, and yes, we do share the same stylist, as the joke never gets old. But it is great to be here at Heritage. You know, when I was a lawyer on Capitol Hill, I used to come over to Heritage all the time when I was over in the Senate and conspire with a lot of my conservative friends, and have been doing so for a long time. And the Heritage Foundation is central to what we're trying to accomplish to retake this country. So I'm always delighted to come here and join with my friends at the Heritage Foundation, particularly on a topic like this. You know, I was blessed to be able to stop off in Nashville, Tennessee on the way up here to do a Lincoln Reagan dinner just outside of Nashville and on Saturday night. And they'd asked me to do that a while back for my colleague, John Rose. It's his district. And, you know, in the beginning of the dinner, one of the hosts asked, you know, well, what are your favorite Reagan quotes? And everybody went around the room with all the quotes you would expect. A lot of the great quotes and tear down this wall and all the things we know about Reagan. But when I got up, nobody brought up the quote that always pops into my mind, which is that we're only one generation away from the extinction of freedom. And that's the reality of, I think, what Reagan recognized when Reagan came in and set out to do something to course correct. And if I was going to say anything at all about this whole topic, one, it's not new. But we just are now talking about it a little bit more intently. But number two, all of the noise in this town, all the noise in politics, all the noise about speakers and vacate and all of the intricacies in Capitol Hill, they don't really mean a thing It's the trajectory shift. It's changing the direction of the country. It's making an actual sizable change for the country and for our kids and grandkids that matter. And that's what I think this topic is actually critically important to understanding the problem right now. With all due respect to a lot of my colleagues, and I'm never afraid to kind of point in both directions in Congress as to how we got to where we are, because it is a bipartisan or nonpartisan problem. It infests the entire swamp. And it's just the status quo that continues in this town that perpetuates the growth of government. And the founders predicted it. Like, they knew it. That's why they separated powers. That's why they divided government both vertically and horizontally and gave power to the states. And they tried to not centralize power because they knew what was going to happen. And so when I go to the floor of the House and I'm railing on some bill, virtually all the bills, it's because almost every bill we're bringing to the floor is in direct contradiction to those core principles that our country is founded upon. And so, you know, I'm want to quote often Madison in Federalist 58 when he said the House of Representatives can not only refuse, but they alone can propose the supplies requisite for the support of government. This power over the purse may in fact be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance, for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure. If I hear one of my Republican colleagues look at me again and say, Chip, we have a razor-thin majority. We just got to win the White House. We just have to win the Senate. Well, when do they ever look across there and say, well, Chuck Schumer has a razor-thin majority? When do they ever look and say, hey, you're actually in charge of the House of Representatives, which James Madison just told you in Federalist 58, actually has the power of the purse. Do something with it. Stop making up excuses. And I just got to be blunt about it. That's right. Stop making excuses. And let's look at what we've done. Let me start with the positive, because it does matter. Over the last 2 years, a year and a half in this Congress, we have, in my opinion, kept the ball on our side of the field. We have largely held spending flat for non-defense spending. Defense spending that went up was paid for out of taking money out of the expansion of the IRS and COVID funding. That's a direct consequence of the conservative push to constrain spending, the agreement with Speaker McCarthy to put caps in place. Now, of course, those caps got blown out of the water in January, but my point is we kept the funding on that side of the field. The debate was there. Take border. We kept the fight on our side of the field. We didn't talk about amnesty. Amnesty was off the table. All we talked about this last year and a half was border security. We didn't achieve it, but we didn't allow the Democrats to start moving the ball down the field and have a debate about amnesty. It matters where you set the goalposts and how you set your mission. But those are the positives. But let's talk about what this Republican Congress funded. We funded a DHS of $62 billion for Alejandro Mayorkas to continue to have a Department of Homeland Security that's allowing our borders to be wide open and empower China and have fentanyl pour into the communities in Texas and throughout our country. We just had another incident in Austin yesterday where 4 people died from fentanyl poisonings in Austin, Texas. I had 6 kids who died in the school district in which I live, just southwest of Austin, in Dripping Springs, Texas, from fentanyl poisoning just last year. It's happening every single day. We funded that. We funded $62 billion, and we said, Mayorkas, hey, you're impeached. It'll die in the Senate. We'll campaign on that, but we're still going to give you the check to keep doing it. We funded $650 million to continue to provide food, shelter, and health care to illegal aliens. We're continuing to provide funding for all these cities that they're using to put illegal aliens in hotels in the cities. We're $200 million for the FBI's brand new headquarters was in the last appropriations bill. After, by the way, we'd campaigned on the first appropriations bill, and the Republicans had said, hey, we're defunding the FBI, which we weren't. We had the $200 million headquarters for FBI, $40 billion for the Department of Justice, which is continuing to carry out attacks on former President Trump and engage in lawfare to undermine all of our system of rule of law and to target the former president. How about the Department of Defense, $824 billion, but we didn't peel back the diversity, equity, inclusion requirements, all of the stuff that's tearing down the morale of the Department of Defense and driving recruiting to historic lows. How about the State Department? We did finally defund UNRWA. We finally did that. But you know what happened last September? Just a mere 2 to 3 weeks before October 7th in Israel? We had a vote on amendments. Remember when we fought to open the place up and have amendments all last year in appropriations? We got 1,100 amendments offered. It exposed a lot of the dirty laundry, if you will, by having all those votes. One of those votes was we had a vote to defund UNRWA in September. It fell just short because 8 Republicans voted against it. They thought it was a good idea to continue to fund UNRWA, even though we knew those dollars were going to Hamas. That happened last September, 2-3 weeks before October 7th. In the wake of October 7th, we managed to defund UNRWA. How about the Department of Education? And there's a couple folks here who are concerned about that. $80 billion for the Department of Education, subsidizing the schools that are teaching our kids to hate America, hate Western civilization, not believe in God, hate their country. We're seeing what's unfolding at the universities as we speak. HHS, $117 billion, zero accountability for CDC or the NIH in the wake of COVID, all of the gain of function research, all of the shutdowns, the lockdowns, shut down the greatest economy in the history of the world. $9 billion for the EPA, billions in earmarks, $850,000 for LGBTQ senior housing in Massachusetts, $870,000 for a group that wants to defund the police in Connecticut. Look, I could keep going, but you all know this. The question is what are we going to do about it? Republicans often give lip service to spending, and they get caught in the trap of focusing on these big numbers that nobody understands. $34.5 trillion of debt. $1 trillion of interest that we're about to eclipse. Now more spending on interest than on defense. $1 trillion of additional debt every 3 months. We throw those numbers around. I do it. Part of it because you have to. You have to talk about the magnitude of the problem. But the fundamental problem is not just that, the weakening of the dollar and the undermining of our economy and the strength of our financial system. It's actually funding the radical left, funding the tyranny, funding the government that's at war with your way of life. You're funding the kill switch that's being mandated for cars that are going to make your cars more expensive. You're funding the tailpipe rule that was just put in place by the administration to say that we're going to have mandated electric vehicles. By 2030, 2/3 of the fleet have to be electric vehicles. You're driving up the cost of everybody's way of life. You're making it impossible for the plumber, the electrician, the mom who wants to just drive her kids around. You're making it impossible for the hardworking American to figure out how to achieve the American dream. And that's at the core, the key issue here. I talked to my staff. Most of my staff, right, are, as you would expect, in their 20s or 30s. A lot of them are questioning the ability to achieve the American dream. They're literally looking at me and saying, I don't know how I can ever afford a house. I don't know how I can ever go do the things that I was told I could do in this country. That's what we're doing. That's the worst thing we could possibly do in a free country, in a country like this country, like America, which is to gut the American dream for our youngest members of our society. And that's what we're doing. We have an opportunity as conservatives, forget Republican, Democrat, as conservatives, we have an obligation, but we have a duty right now to go out and change that. Stop funding the very government that's at war with your way of life. If you do that and use the power of the purse, you can actually take your country back. It's actually that simple. We literally just stop writing the check. And then you can wrest away that growing and obscene government that's killing the American dream for the average American. I think that's our calling. And I'll just end with this, just to say, we're going to run out of time. That point about Reagan and a generation, we're going to see it. We're living it. And the question is whether we're going to be the ones recognizing that we do something about it and change it. And that's why when I go to the floor of the House, that's why when we're having these debates with the Speaker, I'm going to tell you, we're going to have a lot of accountability questions for people who run out as conservatives and then come in here and vote for massive spending bills and then have the temerity to go back out to the American people and tell the people that they're a conservative. When they're voting for big spending, they're voting to empower the left, they're empowering DHS, empowering DOJ, empowering this Biden administration, empowering them to cancel student loans, empowering them to destroy the greatest defense in the history of the world. We've got to stop that, and we have to mean it. And we have the power that the founders gave us, and we should use it. So I appreciate the Heritage Foundation and their recognition of this and all the great staff here, and Kevin, and I look forward to joining the panel. Thanks.
Maybe 2 over, Congressman. All right. Yeah, perfect. You don't want to go too far from your right, do you? Well, look, Chip, thanks for being here. We're grateful for not just your comments today, but your leadership. And I thought what I would do is ask you a couple follow-up questions on your remarks, but also sort of cue the panel that's following you. And we'll cover in that panel education, immigration, the science,
Yeah.
and a couple of other things. But I want to dial back from that.
Yeah.
And you were touching on the question that I get asked the most by heritage friends around the country, and that is this disconnect, but that they perceive. These are just regular Americans. The disconnect they perceive between what y'all do, that's what they say. They lump all y'all, as we say in Texas, in one group, versus what they know to be common sense.
Right.
And we're going to talk about solutions to that, but give us a little inside baseball view to the extent you can about why that disconnect continues to persist.
Well, first of all, it's not new. I can't remember the quote. I'm going to butcher it, but you can Google it. Sam Houston had a great quote about that, about the lack of common sense among our elected officials. And look, I think it just happens because you end up essentially in groupthink, and people end up, they don't want to run at odds with their colleagues. We're having some of that right now. You got primary debates. Who do you side with your current colleague, or maybe a person in a primary that you think is more aligned with your values? But take all that. It's really a function of the way this town operates, and it's built around the continued flow of money and the accretion of power. But I don't even mean that in the corrupt sense. I mean, like, just take defense, for example. I mean, if you leave here with one thing, just know that it is the defense world, and look, this is heritage. I'm a strong proponent of national defense. I grew up a child of the 80s, Reagan and beating the Soviet Union. I want peace through strength. I want the strongest military that we can possibly produce. I want it to be sparingly used. I want it to be able to kick ass, and I don't want to use it that often. If you do, I want to destroy everything in its path. That's what I want our military to do.
A really good summary, Congress.
Right. I mean, and so, but here's the thing. We just default to fear, and we use the national security and defense complex to run over everything else. We just did it. We just did it last week with the foreign aid bill. And there's probably some people in this room, some in the audience are like, well, I'm pro-Ukraine. I wanted to give them some money. And no, of course I support Israel. But we just spent $95 billion completely unpaid for. We funded both sides of the coin in Israel. We funded Hamas at the same time. We're giving money to Ukraine without a clear mission. We're doing all of that on the back of having increased defense spending without making it address all of its woke issues. And we did all of that. By the way, getting the defense increase was the leverage and excuse for funding the entire omnibus in the first place without getting the reforms we wanted on any of these other issues. Because people come in, they literally come in our meetings and say, Chip, we just can't risk defense. Well, if that's what you do, you're never going to change the town. Because they're always going to use defense as the leverage to be able to say, we're not going to cut DOJ, we're not going to cut education, we're not going to go make the reforms. So that's the excuse. You saw it with FISA. You saw we didn't get the warrant protections. We didn't get what we wanted on the FISA issue. So I'm just telling you, those things are the things that actually drive that disconnect. And frankly, I think a lot of my colleagues are blind to it.
A couple of follow-up questions on that. The second one will be what regular people can do to assist there. But the first is to possibly inject a little bit of hopefulness.
Yes.
Which I know you possess. Do you take some solace, maybe even some hopefulness in the fact, for example, that one of the FISA amendment votes was really close? We'll talk about the deciding vote, perhaps. And then secondly, that a majority of your colleagues voted the right way on the supplemental, which is to say against it.
No, this is exactly right. And this Reagan speech, when I was in Tennessee, I was laying down the hopeful end to that, which is we're actually changing the town. I mean, all of you that are out there working, all the conservative activists, all the people that are engaging, all the people that are going and telling your members, Congress, why did you vote this way? We are actually changing this town. It is moving in the right direction. Now, is it moving fast enough? I mean, I'm sitting there and I'm grabbing the wheel and I'm seeing the iceberg and I'm on the Titanic. I know you want to turn that wheel as fast as I want to turn it. I don't think we're turning it fast enough. I'm just going to be blunt. I don't think we are. But I still think we can. And I still think we have an obligation to. And yes, a majority of Republicans voting against the Ukraine bill, despite all of the pressures saying that you need to do that and to go against the leadership and the speaker, that's an enormous accomplishment. It is an enormous accomplishment that 55 members of the Republican conference voted against the rule. That is unheard of. You don't do that. And people say, well, Chip, but that's breaking the place. Yes. Yes.
That's sort of the point, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. People say, well, Chip, I had a colleague one time, I was on the floor of the House, and he looked at me and he goes, I was frustrated about something. I was ranting and raving
really?
About it. And he goes, well, do you just hate everybody? I said, no, man, I love everybody. I just hate everybody here. And he just looked at me and goes, and then one of my other colleagues was just laughing. I said, look, I'm kidding, but this place has a popularity of about 14 to 18%. if I'm against Congress, I'm with 82% of the country. So I just think we need to change the way this place is not working. It led us to this place. Do you think $34.5 trillion of debt, wide open borders, a military that's now woke instead of focusing on where it needs to, an education system that's against us, that's destroying Western civilization? Do you think these are all the things that we ought to be doing? We ought to be funding? We ought to be taxing people and borrowing money to produce those outcomes? It's insane. We should change it.
So let's look ahead. Let's look ahead to the fall, something you and I hear often when we're talking about why the way the establishment is working in Washington, they want us to ignore. And that is, let's say that conservatives capture the White House. There's a conservative majority in the Senate and a conservative majority in the House. Mm-hmm. What are your top 3, 4, 5 things that group of people must do to accelerate this process of taking the country back?
Well, that's a great question, and that's one for,
Oh, you want me to answer?
Well, it's for the larger conversation that we've got to figure out how to crystallize on it. Yep. I will give an answer. I will say the one thing, though, the hurdle, if we accomplish that objective of having all 3 as conservative majority in the House, the Senate, and the White House, you're going to have to get over the excuse that will be dropped on day one, which is, Chip, we don't have 60 in the Senate. That will be the excuse. Literally on day one, they'll say, Chip, we can't do all the things that you want to do because we don't have 60 in the Senate. You have to be reasonable. I promise you, that's coming. So we have to go out and win. We got to win the majorities, but we got to plan now for just driving a steamroller over the weak-kneed individuals in the Congress that will use 60 as the excuse not to fight for you. The things that we ought to do, look, it is hard to prioritize. For me, you have to massively constrain the spending. That will do a world of good on the inflationary front and to strengthen our financial position for homeowners and everything else, but also to constrain the left. If you pull those dollars back, I promise you, they're going to be fleeing, running around. You're cutting those bureaucrats. You're cutting off those programs and constraining it. That's, I think, job 1, because you can touch almost every issue in every area if you do that. Job 2, or it could be 1 if you want to put them in order, is you got to secure the border of the United States. You have to. There are people dying. You've got Lake and Riley. You've got the examples of fentanyl. But guys, it's not just that. This is all purposeful. I guarantee you, I can take a poll. Everybody in this room is pro-immigration, is proud of our history, believes in it. But, I was sitting with some friends of mine the other night in Florida who are a little more left-leaning. And they made some little pejorative jab about, immigration and brown people. And I said, okay, first of all, I'd be happily get rid of virtually every Ivy League graduate and swap them out for every brown person migrating here if that'll make you happy, because I think it'd be better for the country. But okay, put that aside. What if I told you that 51.5 million people in this country right now are foreign-born? What if I told you that's about 16.5% of our population? That's the highest it's ever been, higher than it was in the early 20th century. What if I told you they've got 20 to 25 million kids? What if I told you on top of that our education system is not teaching them to love America, to love Western civilization, to believe in freedom, believe in limited government, believe in personal responsibility? And they're kind of like going, that might be a problem. Yeah, I know. So we've got to deal with the border security issue, deal with immigration, and manage that issue. And I think thirdly, this one, there's so many different issues, but I really do think in order to achieve those objectives and all the stuff, I think if you cut spending, you can deal with the education issues. I think that is really, in Washington, the biggest solution for all of that. The third thing for me is honestly, is having a strong, focused military sparingly used and creating what I think our friend Victoria Coates here at the Heritage Foundation and I talk about as the third way. And it's more the peace through strength model. It's not isolationist, and it's not endless wars. If we don't get our crap together and be focused on having a military that is strong, powerful, but sparingly used, we're not going to be able to save the republic.
And just a quick follow-up to that, and then I'll ask you one final question. It is the rhetorical project of the Washington establishment to create that false dichotomy.
Correct.
You're either an interventionist, peace through strength, which is a total misapplication
Correct.
Of that concept coming from Reagan's think tank. I think we have some credibility there. Or you are an isolationist. Right. It is just total BS,
Yep.
which is the polite way I can put it, so I'll move on.
That's right.
The last question is this. I know this about you, and more Americans need to know this about you. It is not mutually exclusive to rail against nonsense, and God bless you for doing that. And also to be hopeful about the American future.
100%.
In fact, the very reason you do the former is because you believe in the latter. But why did you wake up, in spite of all the reasons you were discouraged or had reasons to be discouraged today, hopeful about the American future?
There are so many reasons. First of all, it's not like this is new, right? I mean, it's not like we've got a, I don't know, vice president and secretary of treasury dueling in the streets. You know, that has happened before. We have had civil war before. We have had strife before. This is not new. And look, I'm hopeful because of the reason Reagan was hopeful. I'm hopeful because it is the greatest country in the history of the world. It is the worst system of government except for all the others. Use all the cliches you want to use. But I'm hopeful because of like the young people and staffers in my office that wake up every single day coming in because they believe in the American dream and they want to fight for it. Even though they're afraid they can't achieve the American dream, they want to get it and fight for it. To the extent there is a DNA of American, obviously we're kind of unique in that we attract all people from around the world. It's not that we're people that are bound together by a certain genetic makeup. We are bound together by that unique experience as Americans, that generational transfer of the American experience. My grandmother was a single mom in West Texas when my dad had polio at 7 years old after her husband, my grandfather, died of cancer in 1949. She didn't sit around and complain about it. She got 2 jobs, got up, helped my dad get through therapy. He's still alive in 81 and walking. It's a little, hit or miss, but he's still walking. And she took 2 jobs, became the first woman elected county clerk in Nolan County, Texas. She didn't look to handouts or federal programs. She didn't complain that her dad was a, adopted, kid that was, we think, half Native American at an illegitimate birth. She didn't run around going, "Oh, woe is me." She just dealt with it, right? Coming out of the Depression. I mean, that was who we were as Americans. That is who we are as Americans. We either adopt that, embrace that, or we're going to fail and we'll be in the ash heap of history. I think we're going to do that. I think you just watch the people in the response to this nonsense on the universities. There are a lot of young people who are looking at this going, this is nuts. Most of this stuff is all being driven by Soros and it's being coordinated. It's a handful of radicals. All this stuff, the transgender agenda, there are many more Chloe Coles in the world than there are these radical trans agenda activists. This is a small little enclave of elites that are using an outsized amount of money to go disrupt this great country. And this is my simple message. They don't get to have America. This is our country. They don't get to have it. We get to have it. That's how I'm hopeful.
Congressman Chip Roy, thanks so much for being here, most of all for your leadership.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, please join me in thanking the congressman. There's really not a drop-off after this panel, believe it or not, because following us is someone who's known throughout this building as being very charming, and that's Richard Stern, who's the grand poobah of heritage, budget, and fiscal policy. His colleagues are sort of snickering, but I really meant that, Richard. And you're going to get the same kind of dose of reading reality truthfully while pointing to some solutions. Please join me as the congressman I depart the stage in welcoming Richard.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts, Congressman Roy as well. I want to welcome you again to the second part of our panel here. So while they went through a little bit kind of the foundation of the issue, Congressman Chip Roy, of course, gave you a little bit of kind of the inside baseball being in Congress, watching the left actually pass legislation that steals our taxpayer dollars and gives it over to their organizations. The next panel we've got coming up here are some of the heritage scholars that are working on solutions to that, defining the exact scope of the problem down to the granular details and working through things that the grassroots and members of Congress can do to actually rectify this. And again, as we were talking about before, we are in a fight for the heart and soul of the country, and it's a stacked fight because the other side has control of the only force monopolist that exists, and that's the government. So I'd like to invite our panel to come join us now. So we've got Lindsay Burke, of course, who is the director of our education center here at Heritage. So, of course, she can tell you all about Hamas University. We're going to get into that in a second. Then we've got David Ditch, who's a senior policy analyst in the Budget Center, my own center here. He, of course, has done an enormous amount of work to go through and itemize all of these grants, all of these things that the left is taking advantage of and gaining access to from your taxpayer dollars. We have Brenda Hafera, who's the assistant director of the Simon Center here at the Heritage Foundation, looking at the U.S. history and our foundation and what is so special about the United States and what is so important about preserving that. And then finally, of course, we've got Mike Howell. He's the executive director of our Oversight Project. And so these are the guys that do hand-to-hand combat in the streets with the left, figuring out exactly how they're stealing our money and getting into it. So with that, we'll get into our panel here. So thank you, of course, for taking your time here and for joining us. So, Lindsay, I want to start with you talking about education. Now, before we had planned, we'd planned this event prior to all of the riots and things that are going on right now, as you can see. But, that's, of course, good timing with what we're talking about, which is this kind of insidious nature of the left taking over institutions using taxpayer money to do it. So I guess the first question I want to start off with is, are the taxpayers getting a good return on investment in their extension, Hamas University at Columbia and now George Washington University?
Well, thank you, Richard. That's a great question. And I think to Congressman Roy's point a minute ago, which was a very important one, this is a small enclave of students at a small number of elite universities who are really wreaking havoc across the country, but they are able to do it, to his point, because of this outsized amount of money that the federal government funds universities with. And if you think about the fact that cumulatively it's about $240 billion a year that the federal taxpayer pays out to American colleges and universities through student loans and grants, tax deductions and credits, and work-study programs. It's a tremendous amount of money. Add to that the $44 billion annually in what are known as indirect cost subsidies for federal research grants. And then you add to that all of the Biden administration's current illegal and unfair and regressive student loan cancellation schemes. This truly is a tremendous handout to some of the most elite students at the most elite universities across the country, and that is what is enabling them to do all of this. So what are we getting for all of this tremendous taxpayer money? We're getting a lot of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion bloat, which really is undergirding a lot of the, I like to use the word riot rather than protest, I think that's accurate, a lot of these riots that we're seeing across the country. My colleague Jay Green in our Center for Education Policy has done a lot of research documenting the bloat in DEI staff at universities across the country. The average university in his study has 45 DEI staff on the payroll at these universities. University of Michigan was at the top of his list with 163 DEI staff. But if we look closer to home, University of Virginia, 94, Virginia Tech, 83. UVA always wins over Tech, by the way. So even in DEI, they're beating them out. Now, keep in mind that Jay Green's study did not include any of the staff that are devoted to ensuring compliance with non-discrimination laws, nor did it count any of the faculty or staff that actually teach in, say, ethnic or gender studies departments. These are just the administrators who enforce DEI compliance across the country. So tremendous bloat. And this is important for many reasons, but one of the reasons it's so important right now is we're seeing this replicated in the K-12 space. So they did a follow-up study looking at K-12 schools across the country, elementary and secondary schools, and found that if you look at the large school districts across the country, 79% of them have now a DEI officer on payroll at elementary and secondary schools, 79%. So large school districts are considered those with more than 100,000 students. But even if we look at just your sort of middle sized district, 15,000 or more students is a middle-sized district, 39% now have a chief diversity officer, which is the K-12 equivalent to a DEI officer on a college campus. So is this leading to better campus climates or school climates? No, that's obvious now in what we're seeing across the country. A large DEI infrastructure does not lead to a better campus climate. These DEI commissariat just reinforce a political orthodoxy on their campuses, which we all understand by now is what our colleague Mike Gonzalez has deemed the undistilled Marxism, undergirding the oppressor versus oppressed paradigm that really is at the heart of everything we're seeing transpire on college campuses right now. And so what are we seeing? And just quickly, I mean, this is, I think extremism is not too strong of a way to put it, but of course, those students who are most impacted right now by this are the Jewish students on college campuses across the country who now have legitimate fears to even be on their school grounds. We all know, but at Columbia last week, the campus rabbi actually advised Jewish students to return home because, quote, Columbia, he said, Columbia University's public safety and the NYPD cannot guarantee Jewish student safety. So he said, go home. And then, of course, just last night, If you've turned on the news at all today, students took over and remain encamped in a building as they protest in favor of a terrorist organization. Let's not lose sight of what they are rioting over. Protesters shout slogans like "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which of course is a thinly veiled endorsement of murder. We also hear chants like "Globalize the Intifada," "Death to the Zionist state," "Burn Tel Aviv to the ground," and "Go Hamas, we love you, we support your rockets too." This is unacceptable. Can you imagine being a Jewish student on a college campus today in 2024? And yet this is what we're funding through that $240 billion in subsidies. There was a student this morning on Fox who said, a Jewish student who said, when she was at the building that they've occupied now at Columbia, that she said she felt like she was in the movie The Shining because of the hammers that were going through the windows. I mean, this is what they're feeling right now. So just to wrap up, I would say that these genocidal slogans are exceeded in their depravity only by the idiocy and confusion of the movement. Exhibit A, of which is the Gays for Palestine signs that we're also seeing at universities across the country. And last thing, it is important to remember that this disgusting rhetoric that we're seeing at some of the most elite institutions in the world is not a function of ignorance. These are among, as I said earlier, the most highly educated people out there. They are well aware of what they're espousing and calling for.
You know, and I think those are all stunning and disquieting things, of course, for all of us to consider and go through. You know, I think one of the things, I'm a numbers guy, and so to put a little bit of a point on as well, you know, the numbers you were just talking about there, it's billions of dollars. It sounds like a lot of money. It is about $200 a month per American household. So you think about what Americans spend subscribing to Netflix and other things, $200 a month per household in America goes to the shenanigans you're talking about, and shenanigans is a generous word. But, you know, as you're talking about, there are cause for optimism. There are things that can be done to rectify this and get back to a good state of being in the country.
Yeah, there are. And if we just look at the Biden administration's student loan debt cancellation schemes that he has floated out there, don't call it forgiveness. It's not forgiveness. You pay for it, right? This is debt amnesty. That alone is costing $3,000 roughly per taxpayer. So that's a lot of Netflix. So it's incredibly expensive. But just, you know, what can we do about it? First, we've got to cut off the funding. There's an open spigot of federal aid that, to quote economist Rich Vedder at Ohio, the federal government is just effectively dumping money out of airplanes onto universities. And so that is enabling all of this bad action. The radicals and the leftist institutions that harbor and educate them are sustained by this open spigot of federal funds, which of course all comes via the American taxpayer. So cut off their funding first of all. Student loan debt cancellation, that has to end. There are lawsuits underway right now, but there's also a role for Congress to play. Congress can end the public service loan forgiveness program that hands out debt cancellation, debt amnesty to people who take on government work. And so ending that program, Congress can really, I think, tamp down on all of this activity that we've seen by eliminating the PLUS loan program. This is one of the biggest drivers of the increases in college costs. So ending that PLUS loan program, making space for private lending to return. So those are just a few of the financial things. But second, colleges should prohibit the wearing of masks and face-covering keffiyehs on campus. They are well within their right to do that. Third, they have to suspend or expel organizations, faculty members, student groups, individual students who call for the genocide of Jews. That is not within their right to do that. Universities are allowing these egregious acts and conduct, right, which we differentiate, but conduct, while at the same time, you'll recall there was a university in California not that long ago that stopped students from handing out the U.S. Constitution on Constitution Day. Like, that is beyond the pale, but calling for genocide is totally fine, apparently. And then finally, dismantle universities' DEI departments. This is something that boards of visitors across the country should be doing. It should be top of their list.
Amen. And it took decades to build those institutions, and we need to do it a lot faster in terms of dismantling them. So I think moving on from that, kind of building on that, David, you know, you and I look at large numbers all the time, trillions of dollar programs, you know, programs that are spending into oblivion. And so a lot of times we talk to people that look at these sorts of dollars and say, well, this is a small percentage of the budget. Now, It's a large amount of money if you asked every American household to individually write the checks. But I wanted to ask you to walk us through how that money is used so easily by the left to leverage into this kind of overwhelming force.
Yeah. One of the things that strikes me, the more I learn about what the federal government does, the more I see that practically every single major problem in society, you can link directly to federal funding. So whether it's economic problems like inflation has been driven heavily by the overwhelming amount of deficit spending that's been going on over the last few years. And if you look at the institutional left, the reason why the left is pushing so aggressively on so many fronts simultaneously, so it feels like every single American value is under siege at all times from all sides, it's because there are dedicated organizations that are directly or indirectly subsidized by the federal government that are either funding the activists or that are serving as incubators for the activists. So again, academia. You have entire studies departments in universities across the country that are devoted to race and gender studies. The only real world effect that has is producing radical leftist ideologues. Foreign policy. You can look at the hard left on foreign policy that is promoting terrorism. You can look in all these different areas. Non-governmental organizations and nonprofits are another major source of power of the left. While the Heritage Foundation is reasonably well funded by a diverse pool of everyday Americans, we're a minnow in a sea of money compared to what the far left is doing. And these far left organizations, so many of them are receiving grants from federal agencies. There are so many different ways that the left is able to take advantage of the sprawling federal apparatus. We need to start chopping away at that if we're ever going to get somewhere. This is not about moving things from a liberal position to a conservative position. The status quo that so many in this city accept blindly and just kick the can down the road because this is just how it is, the status quo isn't just a little to the left, it is so far to the left, it's hard to even see the center. We need to take this problem seriously, and we need people who are willing to stand up against it and call out what's going on.
No, and I think, one of the stats that kind of strikes me about that, so the OECD, which you might think of as they collect data and they put out some articles, is a left-wing think tank funded at 5 times the rate of Heritage's entire budget, all of it from governments, mostly the United States government. And of course, the OECD right now is pushing for a global minimum tax and taxing every retirement savings account on the planet. That's just one of many, many examples of exactly what you were talking about the left using and leveraging those kinds of dollars to push their agenda and push their narrative. So I want to ask you as well, we actually just this morning from Heritage sent out an email to the Hill listing a whole bunch of things that are part of this to defund. And of course, we regularly talk with people in the grassroots and on the Hill, giving them these kind of targets, so to speak, of these organizations and these things that get this money, illegally, what we would consider unconstitutionally. So I want to ask if you want to talk a little bit about kind of some of that work we do to paint these targets.
Yeah, one of the targets that I think really goes under the radar, at least for the American public, is federal research grants for science. And again, if you just talk to the average person on the street, say, is it a bad thing to fund scientific research? The average person can say, no, that's a good thing. And frankly, if you asked me a couple of years ago, I would generally be saying I'm okay with some level of that. The fact of the matter is that these institutions, so the Centers for Disease Control, National Institutes for Health, National Science Foundation, they are absolutely dominated by the radical left. We saw this during the pandemic. We saw these organizations, these institutions that were so eager to lock down Americans, to tamp down on our God-given rights as human beings. We saw the CDC openly colluding with teachers' unions trying to maintain school lockdowns well into 2021, at which point the science told us definitively that children were at very low risk for the disease and were not the primary spreaders of it, unlike the common cold, for example. These are organizations that are one of the primary funders of the radical left in academia. Again, it's not just that the federal government is, through the Department of Education, funding these hard left academic institutions. It's also these science agencies. And I just released a report on how the Biden administration is funding the left, and I found an enormous amount of just brazenly either idiotic or extremely radical grants that are going out. Granted, it's going out under the Biden administration, so to a certain extent, the Biden administration is staffed by the radical left. You expect that's where the money's going to go. But in many cases, again, that's just status quo. That's standard operating procedure for these organizations. And these are organizations that we do not need to fund at this level, let alone an increasing level every single year. We need members of Congress who are willing to stand up for the American public and say no more.
Amen. Absolutely. Well, and so Brenda, you've done amazing work here at Heritage, outlining the history of the United States, what it means, what our philosophy as a country, how that's illuminated the world. And, one of the things you and I have talked about before is I always love the quote from Margaret Thatcher where she observed that the U.S., was unique in that we were a country bound by that kind of ideology, that kind of commitment to philosophy, not just an accident of history. And so as we've been talking about here, as truly alarming as the Hamas riots are on college campuses, the left is going after the heart and soul of our country. So I wanted to ask you about that, if you could talk with us about kind of exactly how they're going after those foundations of our nation.
Right. Thank you, Richard. I think a lot of people are concerned about this, right? They express that concern when they say, I'm afraid America won't be here for my children. And what they mean by that, they're not afraid that the physical territory is going to be broken up, right? They're not afraid the Canadians are going to invade and annex parts of the United States. They're worried that their children won't care about the things that truly make us Americans. And that's a way of fundamentally transforming the country to make it very different. And we see this as a deliberative strategy in our attacks on our origin story, attacks on the principles of the Constitution and the Declaration. And the origin story of any country is important, but as you mentioned, Richard, ours is particularly important because our commonality of principle is really what unites us as Americans. And these attacks are coming in multiple forms. They're coming in critical race theory, in identity politics, the 1619 Project, and all of them are fundamentally about changing the narrative of America. So on the one hand, America is united by the central principle, all men are created equal. And the American story is us continually striving towards that principle, even if we do so imperfectly. But on the other hand, the critical race theory narrative is that America is irredeemably racist, that it's institutionally racist. It's a series of battles between the oppressor and the oppressed. And not only is slavery our original sin, but our very origin. And so this is the objective is to taint the history of America, taint our documents, our principles, to undermine them so that they're more easily replaced by something else. And unfortunately, this has been quite effective, right? Today, 4 in 10 Zoomers believe that the Founding Fathers could be more accurately described as villains rather than heroes, 4 in 10. So the CRT story is being told in our classrooms, our common culture, and unfortunately at our presidential homes and museums, most notably James Madison's home of Montpelier. So while Madison is discussed during a portion of the House tour and through a video, there are currently no exhibits at Montpelier dedicated to James Madison and his accomplishments. And James Madison is kind of an important guy. He's our 4th president. He's the father of the Constitution. He's the author of the Bill of Rights and wrote many of the Federalist Papers, which ensured the ratification of the Constitution. But he's mostly missing at Montpelier. So instead of honestly recounting the founding narrative, Montpelier omits facts and engages in gotcha efforts to promote the CRT narrative. So for example, they have a display with pictures of the first 18 presidents and their relationship to slavery. And under Madison, it notes that Madison never freed his slaves, but it omits that Washington did. Under John Adams, they note that John Adams never owned slaves, but some of his legal clients did. And Abigail grew up in a household that enslaved 2 individuals. Now, with the exception of an archaeological exhibit, all the exhibits at Montpelier are talking about race, slavery, and Jim Crow. The single exhibit for children at Montpelier aims to teach kids about race and encourages parents to do so. And one of the ways they say that you can do this is through children's books. And one of the books they have there encourages little kids to imagine themselves not as the victim, but as the aggressor, whipping someone until his flesh cried blood. And that description is accompanied with a silhouette of a man hanging from a rope. These are not encouraging narratives, to say the least, to encourage our children to love their country. Now, unfortunately, Montpelier has been aided by both state and federal funds in some of these efforts. So they were awarded funds from the Commonwealth of Virginia to develop anti-racist curriculum for use in Virginia schools. They then used the development of that curriculum to justify their receiving a federal grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and it seems another one of those grants was used to fund the children's exhibit that I mentioned. The organization that owns Montpelier, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, engages in lobbying efforts, and they own 27 historic sites around the country. They are funded also by a slew of corporations, including the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, which has committed $250 million to transform the way history is taught in the United States, and of course, George Soros's Open Societies Foundation. So I'll just end with this final note, which is to observe that these efforts are often aimed at our children, to teach our kids that America is not deserving of their dedication, and places like Montpelier are incredibly important. There's only one home of James Madison, and kids often go there on field trips, and they remember that experience of being in the room where James Madison thought about the Constitution, right? So I think it's incredibly important that we push back against these efforts because these sites are important, and that's why they're a target.
I think that's a beautiful and powerful way to frame the issue. You know, you cannot exist as a country or culture if those institutions you're talking about are destroyed and demolished, and that is what the left is doing. I appreciate your powerful testimony on that, and I've appreciated the battle you've been doing with them and with the people that run Monticello that have also defiled it in a similar kind of fashion. So, you know, so the other thing, of course, then is there's also immediate fights that are going on as well, bringing in more kind of elements to destroy our culture, to change the makeup of our country. So, Mike, I want to ask you about some of the work you've been doing. Now, I'm going to start by asking kind of a personal finance question. So we all know that things are expensive today. In general, it's hard to afford homes. In fact, many Americans think that because of all the spending the government's doing, because of the inflation, they'll never be able to afford a home. Mike, I've been told that the best way to buy a home in America today is to actually go to Mexico, renounce their U.S. citizenship, find one of these federally financed cartels, and get them to smuggle you back across where you can get all of these free benefits paid for by taxpayers from all of these liberal states. Is that the best way to buy a home these days, Mike?
That's an interesting question, Richard. I would recommend that plan to anybody who likes free travel, free housing, 3 hot meals delivered them to a day, free work assistance, free babysitting services in the name of public education for their kids, for a country's cultural and political mass to celebrate you with the highest honors, well above native citizens, people who like preferential treatment of the law, where if you commit a heinous crime, a DA in one of these urban centers will plea you down to the lowest possible thing to avoid anything in your immigration file. So that's a great plan if you like all those things. But I would just ask you, hold off on publicizing that. Let's wait until about mid-January of next year to tell people this, and we'll get all the radicals that we've been talking about to head down there and try this so we can close the door and lock it behind them. But it's a huge, huge problem we got going on. I want to bounce off something Congressman Roy said up here, where the United States is basically funding both sides of a lot of foreign wars. Well, they're also doing that domestically. Right now, everyone in this room is paying hand over fist for the invasion of the United States. They're doing that in a lot of ways. Obviously, the most clear one is the Department of Homeland Security has turned from a entity that was established to protect this country to one that is promoting the invasion thereof through policy, turning the Border Patrol into babysitters and Uber drivers, and through this very complex web of spreading people into the United States. But there's another way they're doing it, and that's through the grant-making power of the United States federal government. We have billions of dollars a year that go out to a sophisticated web of nonprofits and then other international organizations that implement a sophisticated and complex architecture to get people from, I think the numbers right now up to 160 different countries across the border, millions and millions of them in record numbers, all the way from their home countries over, to South and Central America, up into the border, and it doesn't stop there, where they're then taken care of by nonprofits that, operate with religious names of the United States and spread them out into every community in the United States, where then they get another bite of the apple, where the cities and states that provide services to those illegal aliens bill those costs back to the federal government. And so this is a massive, massive industry. It is one that for far too long conservatives in D.C. have actually promoted. It wasn't until a couple of years ago where defunding the nonprofits in the border and immigration space actually became a plank. And that happened only at the beginning of this Congress, when Congress passed that border bill, H.R. 2, which defunded the entirety of it. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of people, didn't understand this issue. It's tough to see the name of a group like Catholic Charities and then think, immediately jump to the fact that they're engaged in this evasion promotion. But that's what's happening. And to make this point so clear, the head of the Department of Security, Homeland Security right now, Alejandro Mayorkas, what was he doing immediately prior to being the secretary? He was on the board of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, one of the 6, 800-pound gorilla nonprofits that oversees this entire infrastructure. And in his Department of Homeland Security, he's not populating it with people who would have even, flown in the Obama administration, where they at least, tipped their hat to quasi-law enforcement sounding people. He's populated it with the very staffers that run those nonprofits. And voila, what you have is the worst border crisis of all time, all by design. And a lot of people are getting very, very wealthy off this as well.
No, absolutely. And then that gives you just a little bit of the scope of this kind of problem here. And I think you're absolutely right, going off of Congressman Chip Roy, that the U.S. government has been funding both sides of so many of these issues. But part of what Mike's talking about here is that the left has spent decades building these institutions, seeding the ground, generating generations of new radicals. In fact, we've had things we've published out of Heritage talking about that a lot of these campus radicals go on to education. They go on to the kind of NGOs you're talking about. But Mike, I want to ask you as well, I know we've been doing a lot of work tracking kind of specifically where a lot of these grants go, tracking where they're literally trafficking these illegal immigrants to, and the services they're being provided by these local and state governments, which I do want to mention, by the way, as much as it is local and state governments that are funding a lot of these benefits, they get $1.1 trillion a year of federal transfer money. That's money stolen from federal taxpayers, given the states and localities to do all manner of things with, a lot of which goes right back to these NGOs. So, Mike, I want to ask you a little bit about kind of that work we've been looking at, some of the things that we've unveiled about that.
Yep, absolutely. And one point I'd like to kind of make before I get into that is the biggest misconception that I fear that a lot of people in America have is that this illegal immigration to the border is an organic phenomenon. And they like to pretend it is. They even say it's climate change related now. It is not. It is the product of a lot of sophisticated and hard work over time in setting up this complex web. So understanding that and really trying to change the debate as we talk about border security, we've done a lot of things. Working with my colleague Laura Reese, who runs our Border and Immigration Center, we basically looked at 30 nonprofit organizations down at the border and bought the cell phone data to track the movement of cell phones of illegal aliens that appeared in those nonprofits and to see where they went later. So 30,000 devices in a 1-month period is what we looked at. That is a very, very small fraction of the 10 million plus across the border. So small sample size, 30,000. Guess how many congressional districts they went to in the United States in a 1-month period? Virtually every single one, but for one. Everywhere. And this is all made possible because you have physical locations and people, a lot of them cartel affiliated, by the way, that set up the end locations for people to go to and are planning and strategizing about where to send people in every state, red or blue. This happens everywhere. Another thing we've recently put out there is, and this is a 5-alarm fire in my view, is the impacts on our election systems. We are not ready for tens of millions of illegal aliens in this country while we have this vote by mail honor system joke of an election system. If you think the left is not going to try to take advantage of this, if they won't take advantage of those rules to prevent Donald J. Trump from being president, I think you're crazy. It is too tempting. It's too many people, and that's why they're fighting at every single step to make sure there are no limitations to illegal aliens voting. That's what their litigation efforts are for at the end of the day, to leave the vulnerabilities wide open so they can't vote. And so leaning into this, we sent some undercover journalists that we are working alongside into a nonprofit in New York City, where they basically asked for a residency document, a fake residency document of this shelter in New York. And at first, they're like, no, we can't do that. That's illegal. And they said this to the white-looking guy, okay? A day later, a non-white-looking guy comes in, asks for the same thing. I said, yeah, come on over here, $10. We'll give you the fake fraudulent document. And so we put that out. It got a lot of traction. Residency is one of the elements to be able to vote in some New York elections. So you're satisfying one element there fraudulently. Sent it over to our good friend, AG Letitia James there for a criminal investigation. Obviously, she's doing nothing for it. But while in New York, we also learned something else. That was common knowledge amongst the illegal aliens, that there was literature being handed out in the staging invasion camps in Mexico, encouraging illegal aliens to explicitly vote for Biden. So the guys went down there. Guess what they found? The exact thing that they were told was there, in a porta potty, inside the facility. Piece of paper basically said, and this is up on our Twitter feed, don't forget to vote for Biden. So these places are radical political centers. And it's not just that flyer, by the way, the nonprofit in Mexico. We put out a lot more of paraphernalia, signage, and political activism that has occurred there over the years. They even made a balloon sign that said, "Buy Trump." Can you believe that? A balloon sign. These people are supposed to be, illegal aliens so desperate. Apparently they're going to Party City and buying, balloons like it's a children's birthday party. But that's what we're up against. And these radicals who have, by the way, and I'll stop there, the head of this nonprofit center, she went on camera and said her job was to fight U.S. policy, admitting to be a subversive agent. And these are the people who have populated this ecosystem that everyone in here is paying for. And it's all designed at the end of the day to replace your voting capital in this country and your control over this country. Let's not get it twisted on what the end goal is. That's the end goal, to fundamentally transform this country. And they're well on their way. And every day we don't stop it, it gets a lot harder to undo.
And that is that march through the institutions of the left. They are going through the soul and foundations of our country, through the NGOs today, through our places of higher learning and education, and using your taxpayer money to take advantage of that, using the money you worked hard to produce to be able to do these things and to destroy our country from within. So that we want to open it up for questions from all of you and get into a conversation, of course. Yep. And I should say, we've got microphones here as well, so when you ask a question, certainly wait for the microphone to come so those online can hear all of your questions. Sir, yes.
JP Hogan, on the defunding with the Supreme Court and Chevron powers, there's this confusion. Is the liberals want the federal government to be the expert, but where our Constitution limits the government so much that it's almost an infringement of your religion if you're saying a local expert isn't just as good. So where is this loopy, if you're having the education for the experts, where do they have a right to say the federal expert is a better expert than the local expert? And how does that then fit into whether Chevron starts falling?
No, I think it's a very good question. So, part of this gets to the heart of what does it mean that when the Constitution gives legislative authority to the Congress versus executing authority to the president. I think the important thing about Chevron deference, though, is that the way it has been used for a very long time is that if there is any ambiguity in the law itself at all, any ambiguity, if it is possible that the agency's interpretation is correct, you have to go with it. So, we've left well beyond the realm of a kind of standardized process of determining which experts are better than others or which experts are fine. But, I'll tell you this as well, though. So, during the entire 19th century, we had very few regulatory agencies, and the way that Congress would do things is gave specific direct instructions to the executive on what they wanted, what kind of things they wanted experts to go get information on. If you go through and look through what Congress used to pass, it used to be a straitjacket. Congress used to say, look, we think there's a problem here. We want real experts to get information and deal with this and that. If you read the laws today, the laws are about as amorphous as saying, hey, there's a thing, executive branch feel like doing something about it. And then the administration does a lot with that. I'll give you one kind of example, I think showing kind of the breadth of the abuse of this. So I used to work for an Iowa member of Congress. Agriculture is, of course, very important there. And there's a law called WOTUS. It's the Waters of the United States. This law was created to govern navigable waters of the U.S. So think like the Mississippi River. The Obama administration redefined a navigable water such that a ditch a farmer dug on his own farm 1,000 feet away from an area that when it rains could have water is now a navigable water. I used to have a map I would show constituents when they come by the office that showed that 98% of the state of Iowa, the entire state, was classified by the Obama administration as a navigable water. That's part of what we're talking about here. And so we have left well beyond the realms of actually talking to real experts and getting what's going on. This has become one of those things where rogue executives and unelected bureaucrats just do whatever they want and pass it off as though the law somehow defends it. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Mario Loyola. I just want to agree wholeheartedly with something David Ditch said at the beginning. The way that I put it is that federal money, especially for the states, poisons everything that it touches, and it's because of all the conditions attached to it. You and I have talked about this a lot, and I worked on this for many years at Texas Public Policy Foundation and came to the firm conclusion that fighting over the conditions attached to federal funding for the states is not going to succeed. What we have to do is just stop putting conditions on federal funding, because the federal government, Congress, borrows 5% of GDP as the deficit. It sends almost all of that money to the states in order to take over their operations, and we just have to separate federal and state fiscal operations. Is there any appetite for that, or at least killing the conditions attached to federal funding and eliminating the incentive to send it that way?
Right now, it's hard to say. It doesn't seem like that is a big campaign priority among conservative candidates. I think it needs to be. I'll just give one example of where the federal policy forces even red states to fund the infrastructure of the left, and that's highways. So again, another thing that 80–90% of the country is going to say, should the federal government be supporting our highway system? They'll say yes. Okay, are they going to support the longstanding federal policy that every single state, that every single metro area needs to devote about 20% of highway funds for mass transit, which is used by 0.5% to 1% of the country, which is essentially a jobs program for unionized government workers that form an important cog in every urban political machine in the entire country? That money cannot be justified based on the public value. It can only be justified based on the political value to the left. If you were to pull the federal government back, the states are still going to fund their highways. They just wouldn't be funding the transit agencies. There are countless examples like this.
If I could just add really quickly, I think where that works really well is where you have the feds providing a relatively small share of the overall pie, but the regs have gotten way beyond that small share. So my area, K-12 ed in particular, I think is the best example. And everybody probably knows the numbers, but the federal government only finances about 8.5% of all K-12 education spending. So states and localities pay for 90+% of everything that is spent on K-12 ed. And yet, the rules, the red tape, the regulations that are handed down from Washington are tremendous and tie the hands of local public and private school leaders. And so there has been a lot of conservative support in Congress over the years for something known as A+, that would basically do what you just described. It would say, look, that 8.5%, we're going to just hand it back to the states, restore responsibility over that money to them, and allow them, states, to put that money toward any lawful education purpose under state law. And we think that would right-size that relationship as we move toward eventually winding down the Federal Department of Ed.
Sorry, my name is Larissa Uli. I have introduced myself other times as well when we had conferences over here to the Heritage Foundation. I came lately in the US from Albania, and I will become a citizen this year. So, thank you. And I will vote for the first time. And due to my job that I meet a lot of people, one of the person that I met lately was working for the mayor, Muriel, in DC. And the question that she made me, it kind of disturbed me because she asked me if I already registered to vote. And I was like, I'm still waiting for my citizenship for me to register. And she said that you don't need to wait for it because if you have resided here in the US at least for 30 days, you can vote. And she showed me all the ways how to register on the DC website for me how to vote. Of course, I said, oh, really appreciate the information and just moved on. But these people are going to show to vote. What are the steps that are going to be taken for them to stop to vote? This is my question. If you are aware about it, that everybody is registering in an official website of DC for them to vote.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. So in D.C., just like in New York, there's a lot of efforts to get people to vote in the local election there, but that's going to create mass confusion about eligibility to vote in the federal elections, which I think is absolutely by design. So what can be done about it is honestly not much at the legislative level, at the federal level. There was this introduction of a bill that would add a requirement for proof of citizenship, which is so commonsensical. But of course, that's going nowhere, partially because Congress does a category of things called messaging bills, and that was in that category of messaging bills, whereas the real stuff that actually passes Congress is tied to the foreign aid type things that Chip Roy was talking about. So Congress will not fix this, and not anytime soon. At the state level, there are efforts underway to shore that up, but obviously that's only going to happen in certain states. Like New York is not going to introduce a statewide proof of citizenship requirement. And so we're in really tricky territory. It falls to basically litigation. And I mean, this is where a lot of criticisms have been levied at the right in recent years, where the mass litigation efforts to shore up our election system. And so that's something we're putting a lot of thought and energy to. And I don't mean to be to use the term black-pilled on this, but that's the plan. The plan is to leave these election systems vulnerable so that people can abuse them. That's why they don't want to close the loopholes. And I think we need to start talking about it so openly, and that's why it's one of the most dangerous things to speak about openly. After we released the stuff we put out, we've gotten roasted by every single political fact, AP News, everybody. Hit pieces. New York Times is going to drop a hit piece on us in a couple days here. They are very prone and defensive of this criticism. It's the same reason why the election system itself now, whether through the big Dominion or Smartmatic or any of those, are literally the election system is suing people who have criticized the election system. And so this is the prize jewel for them. And fighting it is very, very difficult and very, very hard, needs to be done, but we should start speaking openly about the fact that our election systems are not safe from foreign voting. And that's all we can do right now, and get in court and keep putting stuff out there that forces action.
Part of this is the left for decades has viewed the government as the solution. And so while conservatives tend to go make businesses and organizations and do things that contribute positively to society, what a concept, the left tends to take over the government and do the things you're exposing and talking about. As one of our colleagues here, David Burton, likes to say, you might not take an interest in politics, but politics has an interest in you. And so it's good to remember what the left is doing there.
One last final point. This is something I think we should really be concerned about looking forward. We're not even going to be able to necessarily prove that illegal aliens voted. Say the election happens and we all wake up the next morning and it's blatantly obvious by the numbers to everyone some other funny tricks happened. The systems are designed in a way now not to be auditable and to go back and check those things. And so we're going to be in a potentially huge crisis in this country if after Election Day, everyone rightfully believes that the steps weren't taken to prevent illegals from voting and it happens anyways, and there's all this ongoing fights about it because they designed the systems in a way that no one can even go back and look at them, and that's what's happening right now.
Well, I think we've got time for one more question, so I think I saw your hand up earlier.
You know, much has been said about education, which I really appreciate. And I was going to ask, just like the left is able to grow these left-wing radicals through university systems, through K-12 systems, and your comment about ceding government to the left, I think is really relevant. How can the right, in a sense, grow this next generation of leaders, bureaucrats, and business owners, and not cede key ground to the left, instead grow the next generation of patriots?
So 2 quick things on that. First and foremost, we have to see school choice expanded across the country. It starts in the K-12 level. Every single kid, day one, should be funded with an education savings account instead of assigning them to a government-run school that's indoctrinating them. So the default position should be that every single child is a chooser. That will go a long way in correcting course on a lot of this. Until we get to that point, and we're making phenomenal progress getting there. We now have 10 states that have universal school choice. We had 0 states 3 years ago that had universal choice. But while we're waiting on every single child to have access to a private school or option that is aligned with their family's values, we also have to pay attention to what the government schools are teaching. And so engaging with your local school boards, engaging on curriculum. And so we're seeing more and more progress there as well. I think conservatives are starting to do that to a much greater extent than they ever have in the past.
I think to that, and I appreciate your question, one of the things that we all believe here at Heritage is that the family is really the fundamental unit of society and civilization. And if you look at everything the left is doing, everything that we've talked about here today, one of the things that's under assault is the family, is the ability to keep our culture, to preserve it through generations, to raise kids the way that parents feel like is best, and to let them have access to the futures they can build for themselves. So, we appreciate your time with us today. Thank you for coming to listen to our panel and to talk with us about this issue and this assault from the left on the nation using your resources to do it. So thank you again.